الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا إمامنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing in أسس النظر في علم الأثر, which is explanation of al-Bayquniyyah. The next one, Sheikh al-Bayquni mentions, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, وما أتى مدلسا نوعان الأول الإسقاط للشيخ وأن ينقل عمن فوقه بعن وأن والثاني لا يسقطه لكن يصف أوصافه بما به لا ينعرف. التدليس. So next we're going to go into the next topic. It's really hot in here. We're going to go into the next topic of, it's called at-tadlis. At-tadlis, it literally means to hide something. It literally means to hide something. What is at-tadlis? Where does it occur? In the hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or in the asanid, the chains of narration. Where it occurs is, so when you hide something, think of somebody that's selling fruit. The top layer of the fruit, he puts good, ripe fruit, and the bottom under it, he sells you a big box, and the bottom is fruit that's gone rotten. This is called tadlis. Because why? He's showing you what's good, and he's hiding what is radi, which is he's hiding what's gone bad. So that's a type of tadlis. That's a type of tadlis. This happens in the chains of narration as well. So there are different forms that this takes. The first form is called tadlisul isnad. It's when you hide your chain of narration. This occurs when a person, he reports from his sheikh. So for example, in this particular case, we have al-Bukhari. Let's say, this never happened, but let's say Bukhari, he reports from al-Qa'nabi always. And he reports a bunch of hadith from him. However, there's one hadith that he reports from al-Qa'nabi, and he just says, Bukhari says, an al-Qa'nabi, from al-Qa'nabi. And he intends, I'm just going to put here, from al-Qa'nabi. What he intends here, this particular hadith that he's reporting, he didn't actually hear it from the Qa'nabi. He heard it from somebody in the middle here that he doesn't want to mention that he heard it from this person, so he'll just go to the next person up. This is called tadlisul isnad. So he reports it with an, which isn't necessarily indicative of hearing it directly from the shaykh, right? If I tell you a hadith and I say, I have a hadith for you from the Prophet ﷺ. He said, al-birru husnul khuluq. Righteousness is good character. Did I hear that from the Messenger ﷺ directly? No. I just reported it from the Prophet ﷺ. So this isn't a form of lying at all. But he'll say, there's a hadith that I have from al-Qa'nabi. But he doesn't have it directly from al-Qa'nabi. He has it, this particular one hadith, from somebody from al-Qa'nabi. Why would a person do this? A person would do this because he hears from al-Qa'nabi. He wants his narrations to go through al-Qa'nabi. He doesn't want them to go through somebody from al-Qa'nabi. Okay? Now this, for example, let's take this class as an example. Let's say somebody from the attendees has attended every single class except for lesson number 5. In lesson number 5, he goes and he talks to the rest of the students and he says, what did Amr talk about yesterday? And they say, Amr talked about whatever. He talked about, let's say, hadith, which is ash-shadh, the irregular hadiths. So then he goes and says, I'm going to tell you from Amr that he talked about ash-shadh. He didn't hear it from me directly. He heard it from a student from me. But he did tadlisul isnad. He hid his chain of narration, the part of the chain of narration that comes to me, because he doesn't want to have to report from me through a person. And this is not a disparagement. This doesn't lessen the quality of the narrator if he does this. All it does, if a narrator does this all the time, it just makes us, when he says an, from, we have to verify who he heard from. We have to make sure that he's heard from that teacher before. Okay? So that's the first type. He says that a rawi, a narrator, reports from a sheikh that he's heard from some hadiths, like 10, 15 hadith. However, the one he's reporting, he didn't hear him directly from him. He heard it from somebody from him. So he takes out the somebody in the middle and he reports it from the first sheikh with a terminology that doesn't necessarily mean that he heard it directly, such as an, which is from. The second one is tadlisu taswiyah. At-taswiyah. It means that when a person, he reports it from his teacher, fine, he reports it from his teacher. So in this particular case, what he does is, he comes to this, he reports it, al-Bukhari reports it from al-Qa'nabi. Al-Qa'nabi is thiqah. He's very, very, very trustworthy. Then let's say that there's a person here, Ibn Lahi'a. Ibn Lahi'a, I'll just put it like this, Lahi'a. He's a weak narrator. He doesn't mention Ibn Lahi'a, and he says, al-Bukhari says from al-Qa'nabi, from Nafi'. He skips Ibn Lahi'a. He skips Ibn Lahi'a. You see, this is another type of tadlis. It's another type of hiding your chain of narration. This one here is bad. This is bad. Why is this bad? Because by reporting it in this way, you've made it look like the chain of narration could be authentic. And then people will start to think that this is authentic. But if you report it in the other way, you haven't given the impression that it's authentic, because you haven't taken somebody out that was weak because you wanted him to not be out. You see? So this is actually, this is worse. So, when you do hadith with taswiyah, the second type, it's when the person, he reports it from his teacher, and he says, haddathana, I heard my teacher say. Then he says, from the person that is trustworthy, and he skips in between them a person that is weak. This is the worst kind of tadlis. And this is why Al-Imam Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, he used to say, I would rather commit a zina than do tadlis. Why is that? Because you've given the impression that the hadith is authentic. And you've given so the reasons that people do tadlis is that sometimes they want people to think that they have a higher chain of narration than they actually do. And sometimes they heard like 1,000 hadiths from their teacher, and then there's one that they didn't hear, so they say, you know what, khalas, mashiha, yani, we'll just consider it as if I heard it. And other reasons, and there's other reasons that a person could do that. So those are the first two types of tadlis, which is in the isnad. The second type of tadlis is called tadlis al-shuyukh. Tadlis, hiding your sheikh, which is by either hiding his name or calling him by a name that he's not known by. You call him by some nickname which he's not known by, right? So for example, there's a sheikh, his name is Ali al-Hindi. Ali from al-Hind, from India. Who is Ali al-Hindi? Nobody knows. There's millions of people named Ali from al-Hind. Ali al-Hindi is better known as Sheikh Abu al-Hasan al-Nadawi. Sheikh Abu al-Hasan al-Nadawi is a great scholar of hadith from Nadwatul Ulama in India. So when you hide his name, this is called tadlisu al-shuyukh. You changed his name from a more well-known name to a less well-known name. So in this particular example, you would come to somebody like al-Qa'nabi, let's say he's weak, or Ibn Lahi'a. You don't call him you don't say haddathani Ibn Lahi'a. You say, let's say his kunya is Abu Muhammad. You say haddathani Abu Muhammad. Nobody knows him as Abu Muhammad. So then you have to go and look, who is this person? Abu Muhammad. Oh, it's Ibn Lahi'a. Oh, it's weak. Okay? And the reason why a person would do this is that the sheikh is weak, and so he doesn't want to embarrass himself. You know, sometimes when you're young, you learn from a teacher that you are embarrassed that you studied with this person when you're older. Some people, they get embarrassed by their teachers when they get older. Like you study with some like fanatic person, some sectarian person, and then you get embarrassed. When you get older, you're like, yeah, that guy used to be my sheikh. So then when you're reporting the hadith, you can't lie and say you didn't hear from that person. So what you do instead is you give him a different name, a nickname that he's not known by. That way, you save yourself the embarrassment of people saying, you studied with that moron? You studied with that fool? Right? So, and also sometimes people do it because the sheikh is younger than them. They don't want to report from somebody that's younger, so they'll change his name to try to make it seem like, oh, he didn't report from somebody that's younger, right? Or, for example, in the old days, some of the governments of the Muslims, they would prevent certain scholars from reporting hadith. Like during the time of Imam Ahmad, he was prevented from reporting hadith. So in that case, if somebody reports from Imam Ahmad, they don't want people to know. They don't say, I was told by Ahmad ibn Hanbal. You put yourself in trouble that way. You say, I was told by Abu Abdullah, father of Abdullah. Why is that? Who's Abu Abdullah? There's thousands of Abu Abdullahs. But people know, the muhaddithin, they know you're talking about Ahmad ibn Hanbal, although the government officials or the police, they might not know who Abu Abdullah is. And the government officials aren't going to check who's the teachers of Abu Abdullah so that they can say, oh, no, I know his teachers. It's this person and that person. They don't care. They're busy with just dealing with the government. And sometimes the reason sometimes people would do this so that they can change, they can sort of beautify their chain of narration. So if, for example, let's say that your teacher's name is Muhammad ibn Yusuf, and you reported 1,000 hadith from him. So every day you're going to say, I was told by Muhammad ibn Yusuf. I was told by Muhammad ibn Yusuf. Some days they would call him, I was told by Abu Sulaiman, if his name is Abu Sulaiman, just so that it doesn't seem repetitive over the course of time. So in the case of a person that does tadlis, and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the great scholar of hadith, he wrote a book on these scholars that do tadlis, that they hide the chains of narration. Sometimes they're not exactly clear in their chains of narration. And he talked about who are the ones that are very, very prone to doing this and who are the ones that are not so prone. If a person is very prone to doing this, then we don't accept the narrations until we know from some other way, some other chain of narration that he's heard from his teacher. Okay? How do we know that? Well, for example, you check the entries in the biographies and you'll see this student is very well known to have studied with this teacher. So when he says an, we can accept it. Or if he's not known to have studied a lot with that person, we check all the chains of narration of that person and we see, did he ever at one point say haddathana, I was told? Because haddathana, it's not the same as an. An is very flimsy. From, I heard from somebody. From this person, it could be interpreted as you heard it directly or you heard it with many different people in the middle. But haddathana, he told me, no, there's only one thing that can mean. So if you didn't hear from him and you're saying you heard from him, you're a liar. So your hadith is rejected altogether. So in that case, the mudallis that says an, and he's hiding his shuyukh, we have to make sure that the person has actually heard from that person with checking all the chains of narration to see if they have reported from them in that way. So then he goes on to say and to talk about al-hadith al-shadh. Al-hadith al-shadh, it means the hadith which goes outside of it goes outside of the pattern of the chain of narration. And we'll give examples of this. So he says, وَمَا يُخَالِفْ ثِقَةٌ بِهِ الْمَلَى فَالشَّاذُ. So whenever a trustworthy narrator contradicts contradicts more narrators, then it's called ash-shadh. Ash-shadh is one of the aqsam al-hadith. It's one of the forms of al-hadith. We'll get rid of this because this is from last week. Ash-shadh, I think it has... yeah, well, this is good, inshallah. So al-hadith al-shadh, it means irregular. Okay? So think about it. If somebody has a heartbeat, and their heartbeat normally goes like boom, 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 boom. If their heartbeat is like doing all sorts of crazy things, what are they going to tell you? You have an irregular heartbeat. You have to go to the doctor. He's going didum, 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 playing some song or whatever. It sounds like a drum. That's not how your heart is supposed to sound. They call it irregular heartbeat because it goes against the norm. So this is what ash-shadh is. It's when a narrator goes against the norm. In this particular case, or he goes against somebody stronger than them. So in this particular case, let's take the example of a chain of narration that occurs quite a bit. You have at the top, of course, the Messenger ﷺ. Under him, let's say, the example we're going to say is, we have two narrators from the Prophet ﷺ. We have Aisha and we have Abdullah ibn Umar ibn Umar, and we have Aisha. Okay. So then from these narrators, we have Salim. We have Salim here. This is the son of Ibn Umar. And from here we have Urwa, the nephew of Aisha. Who reports from these two people is going to be one person here. His name is Az-Zuhri. Okay. Then from Az-Zuhri, you have two scholars of hadith that report this narration. Malik ibn Anas and Ibn Uyaynah. Okay. In this particular case, let's say Malik and Sufyan ibn Uyayna, they report this hadith. This is one hadith. This one hadith. Malik and Ibn Uyayna disagree on the wording of the hadith. Whose narration do we give preference to? Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal says that we should give preference to Imam Malik. But Ali ibn al-Madini, who's on the level of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he says, no, if they disagree in the chain of narration or the hadith, we should give preference to Sufyan ibn Uyayna. So then they met with each other one year or one day and they debated each other. Who do we prefer in this particular case? So Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, I and Ali ibn al-Madini were once sitting together and we started to talk about who is the most authoritative and trustworthy when it comes to the reports from al-Imam al-Zuhri. So Ali ibn al-Madini said, Sufyan ibn Uyayna. It's this guy. He's stronger as a reporter from al-Zuhri. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, no, it's actually Malik ibn Anas. So then he said, Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, Ibn Uyayna made 20 mistakes. He made 20 mistakes when reporting from al-Zuhri. Look at the scholars of hadith are not playing games. What they do is to figure out if a narrator is strong, they take all of the hadiths from Ibn Uyayna from al-Zuhri and compare them to the narrations of Malik from al-Zuhri, to the narrations of al-Thawri from al-Zuhri, to all of the narrators from al-Zuhri to see how many times Ibn Uyayna went against the majority and the norm. Ahmad ibn Hanbal decided or concluded that Ibn Uyayna made a mistake 20 times. So then he said, هات ما أخطأ فيه مالك. Okay, Ali ibn al-Madini, how many times did Malik make a mistake when reporting from al-Zuhri? And he says, فجاء بحديثين أو ثلاثة. He said he mentioned 2 or 3 mistakes. So then he said, فنظرت ما أخطأ فيه سفيان. So then I went back and checked again because he said it was 20, but I went back and checked and I found out there's actually more than 20. So it was 20 plus. He has 20 plus mistakes. So logically speaking, who do we accept here? Who's stronger? Malik. As a narrator from al-Zuhri, it's Malik. So this means what? When Ibn Uyayna contradicts Malik ibn Anas, this is called ash-shadh. When he contradicts him. The narration of Ibn Uyayna will be called shadh because it goes against someone who's stronger than him in this particular shaykh. This is the whole concept of ash-shadh. Both Ibn Uyayna and Malik ibn Anas are extremely powerful narrators and extremely well-versed narrators and scholars of hadith. They're no jokes. And Ibn Uyayna reported thousands of hadiths, and they only found 20 mistakes from al-Zuhri. That shows that Ibn Uyayna is actually quite strong. But Malik is from al-Madinah. Al-Zuhri is from al-Madinah. Ibn Uyayna is not from al-Madinah. So Malik, there's a logical reason that he's going to be stronger than Ibn Uyayna in al-Zuhri. They're both Madani scholars. This is Madani. This is Madani. They're both from Medina. They live in the city of the Messenger ﷺ. It makes sense. He reports from him and he's stronger than him because he reports from him and they're from the same town. Sometimes in another example, Imam Malik sometimes would contradict a large group of other scholars that reported from al-Zuhri. And so then in this case, we can confidently say that Imam Malik is probably wrong. Because the ones that he contradicted aren't weak narrators. No, they're on his level as being the greatest muhaddithin of all time. So there's a hadith in which there is a lot of narrators report this hadith from a person called Amr ibn Uthman. Amr ibn Uthman. But Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, he reports it as Umar ibn Uthman. So this is an example of Imam Malik reporting a shadh narration. It's not Umar, it's Amr ibn Uthman. 10 narrators report it as Amr and Malik says Umar. Who's more likely to be right? It's the 10. So in this particular case, when you have the narration, this one is called shadh and this one is called mahfuz. Mahfuz, like this. Why is it called mahfuz? From the word hifz, preserved. This is the one that's accurately preserved and this is the one that goes against what is right. So it's called ash-shadh. Now, in this particular situation, depending on what the wording of the hadith is, in this particular situation, let's say that the wording of the hadith contradicts what he says. In this case, it's a weak hadith. It's a weak hadith. If it doesn't contradict and it can be sort of meshed together, we'll say that the wording of Ibn Uyayna ash-shadh, the mahfudh wording of the Messenger ﷺ is what Malik reported. But the meaning is okay, so we don't say necessarily that it's weak in that particular instance. There are a lot of hadiths like this that later day scholars would accept as being authentic to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And an example of that is the report from al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, who said that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam masaha ala al-khuffayn, he wiped on his khuffayn, the leather socks. Okay? 70, this is not an exaggeration, 70 narrators reported it as he wiped on his leather socks. Then one narrator came and said, wal jawrabayn, and his cloth or cotton socks. So all of the scholars accepted that the addition of the jawrab, the cotton socks, the normal socks that we wear, that is a shadh narration that goes against what 70 people narrated it as only the khuffayn. This person added the jawrabayn, he added the cloth socks, and so that narration is considered weak. And the majority of scholars didn't act upon this addition to the hadith because they said it's weak. Okay. Then we have al-maqlub. Al-maqlub is flipped. That's the next form of a illah. It is a defect in the hadith. So shudud, a shadh narration is a defective narration. It has a defect in it. We said that a hadith has 5 conditions. One of them is that it doesn't have a illah, it doesn't have a defect. Shadh is a defect. The next one is maqlub. If you're Arab, you know maqlub because it's a dish. It's called maqlubah. Why is it called maqlubah? Because you take the pot and you flip it before you put it into the pan. Hadith that's maqlub is the same thing. You took a narrator and you flipped it. He says, وَالْمَقْلُوبُ قِسْمَانِ تَلَى. There's 2 types of maqlub. There's 2 ways to flip a hadith. إِبْدَالُ رَاوٍ مَا بِرَاوٍ قِسْمُ. Sometimes you mistakenly change a narrator out for another narrator. So you flip the narrator, you put another one there. وَقَلْبُ إِسْنَادٍ لِمَتٍ قِسْمُ. And sometimes you flip a chain of narration and you add it to the wrong wording of a hadith. So the first one, when a person, he reports a hadith. So let's say that there's a hadith that everybody knows is reported by az-Zuhri from Salim from Ibn Umar. Then there's a weak narrator and he comes and he wants to make himself look like he's very cool. And he's very, he's so cool in his teachers. And so he makes up a person that doesn't exist, a fictitious person, and he plugs him in there and he says, no, I heard it from my Shaykh Yusuf ibn Muhammad al-Iraqi. Doesn't exist. And he told me from az-Zuhri. He told me directly from Nafi'. I don't have to go through az-Zuhri. You see? So this is a way for people that they used to fabricate chains of narration in this way. This is what makes you a wadda', a kadhab, a liar in the eyes of the scholars of hadith. That's the first type of way. Another way is actually a mistake that some people make, which is a mistake that every human being is going to make. So for example, let's say that you heard one hadith from your shaykh and his name is Zayd ibn Amr. But when you report the hadith, you flip it. You say Amr ibn Zayd. Happens all the time. Happens all the time. This doesn't necessarily mean that the narrator is going to be, who did this, he's not a liar. He didn't change it on purpose. But what happened is that he made a mistake. He flipped a name. This happens even with the top level scholars of hadith. Sometimes they'll even report a name that doesn't exist just because it's on the same pattern. So there's an example of Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, one of the great scholars of hadith. He reports, everybody reports it from Khalid ibn Alqamah. He reports it from Malik ibn Urfuta. It's the same pattern. It sounds the same. If you take away the letters, the same pattern. Da 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 da. Malik ibn Urfuta. And he insisted that it's Malik ibn Urfuta. And all the muhaddithin said, Shu'bah, you're wrong. His name is Malik. His name is not Malik ibn Urfuta. His name is Khalid ibn Alqamah. All the scholars of hadith told him, and Shu'bah, very, very strong personality. He's like, nope, It's Malik ibn Urfata. And all the muhaddithin said, you're wrong. And he said, no, all of you are wrong and I'm the one that's right. To the point that one of the scholars of hadith that existed at his time, his name is Abu Awana. Abu Awana, he one day reports the hadith correctly. He says, I was told by Khalid ibn Alqamah. And Shu'bah happened to be there in his class one day. And Shu'bah gets up and he says, it's Malik ibn Urfata. So Abu Awana, because of his respect for Shu'bah, he doubted himself. And he said, sorry guys, I was told by Malik ibn Urfata. So if you check the chains of narration for this narration from Abu Awana, he reports it in two ways. One way is Khalid ibn Urfata, and the other way is Khalid ibn Alqamah, the other way is Malik ibn Urfata. This is an example of a person, he did qalb. He flipped a narrator's name and so on. And this happens with something like Sa'ad and Sa'id, Amr and Umar, stuff like that. Another way is qalb al-matin, when you flip the text of the narration. Remember, the isnad is the chain of narration. Then when you get to the statement of the Messenger of Allah, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الأعمال بالنيات, that's called the matin. That's called the text of the hadith. Sometimes a person will take a chain of narration that belongs to a hadith and accidentally move it to the hadith that's after it. This happens sometimes when the scholars of hadith are reading in the old Kufi handwriting, and they could be dyslexic as well. Some of them could be dyslexic. He's reading and he skips a portion, the isnad, and then the hadith comes afterwards, and he skips over this hadith and he goes to the next hadith. Could be tired. Any reason could happen. We're all human beings. Everybody makes mistakes. And sometimes a person can actually come to the hadith of the Messenger of Allah and accidentally report it in a wrong way. And we mentioned an example of this, which was reported by Imam Muslim in this way, which is that all of the scholars of hadith reported the hadith of the seven who are shaded by Allah Azza wa Jal, that he gives sadaqah and the right hand doesn't know, the left hand doesn't know. I just did it. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand gives. Imam Muslim reports it as the right hand doesn't know what the left hand gives. The meaning is still the same. We still get the same understanding, which is that when a person does this, it is a virtuous deed and so on, and we should do this. However, that's not what the Prophet ﷺ said. He didn't say that the right hand doesn't know. He says that the left hand doesn't know. Why? Because the right hand is what gives. When you give sadaqah, don't disrespect people by giving with your left hand. Give it with your right hand. And so that happens sometimes as well. And it's called al-maqlub. It's called the one that is flipped. They flipped the chain of narration. They flipped the name of the narrator. They added a narrator and stole a chain of narration, basically. Sometimes they changed the name of the narrator. Sometimes they put the wrong chain of narration on the wrong hadith. And sometimes inside of the hadith, they flip the contents of the narration. He says, al-hadith al-fard, individual hadiths. He says, وَالْفَرْدُ مَا قَيَّدْتَهُ بِثِقَةِ أَوْ جَمْعٍ أَوْ قَصْرٍ عَلَى رِوَايَتِهِ. So al-hadith al-fard is when there's one narrator he's the only narrator of this entire hadith. No one else has reported this hadith. That's called al-fardu al-mutlaq. That's called an absolute individual hadith. But however, there's another type which is tafarrud nisbi. It's like relative. It's relatively individualistic. And this happens in a number of different ways. So, for example, we have a hadith from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ibn Umar reports it, and from him Salim, from him az-Zuhri. And from az-Zuhri, and we're just going to put az-Zuhri here. This is called al-hadith al-fard al-nisbi. This is relatively, it's considered to be individual or singular for this reason. You have Zuhri, and then you have, let's say, a bunch of narrators from az-Zuhri. Okay? You have Malik, weak narrator, a liar, a sinner. You have somebody that is matruk. He's been abandoned by the scholars of hadith because of his extremely terrible mistakes. Now, this hadith is reported by a lot of people, so it's not a singular hadith, right? But this person, I don't care that he reports the hadith. I don't care that this person did. I don't care about him. I don't care about him. So technically speaking, relatively speaking, Malik is really the only person that narrated this hadith that I care about. Right? That I care about. These other guys, they don't strengthen this hadith at all. Okay? So this is relatively fard. It's called al-fard al-nisbi. Relative singular. Okay? The other type of fard is when there's just one person and there's literally no one else, like the hadith of the intention. It's a hadithun fard. This is called al-fard al-mutlaq. Al-fard al-mutlaq, which means absolute singular. Okay? So like the hadith of the intention that we talked about, it's reported from Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, he's just one person. From Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Taymi, he's one person. From Al-Qamah ibn Qas al-Laythi, he's one person. From Umar, he's one person. So it's a hadith fard, it's a singular hadith. And that's truly a singular hadith because no one else has reported it. There's another way that there's a hadith that's fard, but it's relatively fard. It's like singular in a certain way, which is sometimes there are narrations that are only reported by members or residents of a particular area or town of the Muslim Empire. So in the books of hadith, you'll see this is hadithun madani. This is a Medina hadith, meaning all of the narrators of the hadith resided in al-Medina. Or hada hadithun shami. This is a Levantine. So all of them are from Syria. All of them reside in Syria. Okay? And then you have also when there's one person reporting from one person in the chain of narration, but the hadith is well known, but in the there's a particular point in the chain of narration where no one else reports it. And an example is that, for example, Ma'mar reports from az-Zuhri from Anas, but the hadith is also reported by other people, the same hadith, like Qatada and Thabit al-Bunani, they report this hadith. So I'll spell it out a little bit better. So let's say we have a hadith from az-Zuhri here. So we have Zuhri, Anas, to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. From az-Zuhri is only one person, Ma'mar. Okay? This is a chain of narration which is fard. Okay? This is a singular chain of narration in the sense that nobody shares with Ma'mar in this chain of narration with this hadith. The same hadith could be reported by another person, like from Anas, it could be, he mentions Qatada. Okay? But the point is that Zuhri has no additional students. There's no students here. You see, Qatada could report it, Thabit could report it as well here. They're on the same level as az-Zuhri, but nobody reported from az-Zuhri this chain of narration all the way like this, except for Ma'mar. He's the only one that's done it. And Ma'mar is strong. Okay? So that's another way that we can define a hadith which is fard, which is singular. So it is relative. What's the point of knowing this? When you know that there's a chain of narration or a hadith that's reported with one person, it's a cause for concern. Always. So when we understand that, when we see the singular chains of narration, we can know that the hadith could potentially have a illah, could potentially have a defect. He says, وَمَا بِعِلَّةٍ غُمُوضٍ أَوْ خَفَى مُعَلَّلٌ عِنْدَهُمْ قَدْ عُرِفَ. Whatever has a defect which is hidden, it's called mu'allal, meaning it's defective. Okay? Mu'allal means it has a illah, which is a defect. So a illah, the official definition of a illah, as we mentioned before, is a hidden defect in the chain of narration that renders the hadith weak, makes the hadith weak. Although if you look at it at face value, it appears to be to the untrained eye. If you don't know ilal, you don't know the defects of hadith, and you look at it, you see this person was born in the year 10 Hijri, and he died in the year 70 Hijri. This person was born in the year 40 Hijri, and he heard from him, and he died in the year 80 Hijri. And you look at the dates, and they're all trustworthy narrators, and you say, authentic hadith. No, not necessarily. It doesn't have to be authentic. It could be weak. It could be munkar. It could be rejected altogether. You see? So this is why it's a hidden thing. Only people that have studied ilal, have studied these things, the defects of hadith, will understand why it's weak. And also, understanding ilal, it comes with practice of reading what the scholars of hadith have said, such as Ali ibn al-Madini, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Bukhari, Abu Hatim, and Abu Zur'a, ad-Daraqutni, and so on and so forth. And how do you discover these ilal? You have to have a strong relationship with the books of al-Tabaqat, the books of the narrators of hadith, and you have to really know how to extract the hadith and look at all of the chains of narration at one time. Right? You can't just look at one individual chain of narration. Sometimes it will stand out. If it stands out, it's not a illah. It's probably something very obvious about the chain of narration. But you have to know, you have to go through each narrator, and you have to go through each teacher that they go through and find out which hadiths they reported from each teacher. For us, there's a lot of difficulty in us doing this, a lot. And that's why after the year of like 300 Hijri, everybody that comes after around the year 300 or 400 Hijri just relies on the people that came before them. Why is that? We talked about the reasons why before. We don't have the tools to go through every single illah. We don't. Some of these ilal that we talked about before are ilal where a person goes to a person's house and tells them, bring me your books. Bring me your books. I'm going to mention an example of that, inshallah ta'ala. And it's an example from al-Imam Muslim. This is just to show that we don't have the capability. We can discover a lot of ilal, but there are certain ones that we simply have to rely on the scholars of hadith to tell us about these ilal. So here's a good example. There's a hadith that's reported, and the hadith goes that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Alaykum bid-dulja, fa inna al-arda tutwa bil-layli." You should travel by night because the earth is folded up at night. So this hadith is reported, and it's reported from Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu. And this particular hadith was reported in a number of different ways. The way that Abu Dawood reports it is from somebody by the name of Khalid ibn Yazid, from Abu Ja'far al-Razi, from Rabi' ibn Anas, from the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So Ahmad ibn Salam al-Naysaburi said, I went to Abu Zur'a with this hadith that was reported by Qabisa ibn Uqba, from al-Layth, from Uqayl, from al-Zuhri, from Anas, who said that the Messenger ﷺ said the earth is folded at night, and so on. So he replied back that I know this hadith to be from Ruwaym, from al-Layth in this way, but who reported it from Qabisa? He says Muhammad ibn Aslam from Qabisa. So then he said Muhammad ibn Aslam is strong. However, he went to Imam Muslim, and he found, and this is what Imam Muslim did. Imam Muslim said, Imam Muslim said, I went to the house of the grandson of al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Okay, who's able to do that today? Where's the books of al-Layth ibn Sa'd? Doesn't exist. Malik saw them. Malik ibn Anas saw them. We can't see them. So this is an example. He said, I went there and I found, and I told al-Layth ibn Sa'd, listen, I told his grandson, bring me the books of your grandfather. He brought it out, and he found out that he reported it from al-Layth ibn Sa'd, okay, from Uqayl, from al-Zuhri, from the Prophet ﷺ. So it's a weak hadith. Zuhri from the Prophet ﷺ is one of the weakest hadiths. So this is an example of the illah that we don't have the ability to find. We don't have the ability to find this illah. Muslim had to point it out to us. Otherwise, the two people that reported it from Zuhri, from Anas, they are strong narrators. So probably what happened is, al-Layth ibn Sa'd, he has his books, but he reported one day from memory. He made a mistake from his memory. His books are what we're supposed to go back to. That's the source material. So when you go back to the books, you'll see that they made a mistake. So that's one example. So that's why we have to rely, when it comes to ilal, when it comes to the science of defects in hadiths, we have to rely on the great scholars of hadith that came before. That's not to say that if you don't gather all of the chains of narration for a hadith that you can't discover ilal. You can. But it's very, very, very hard. Usually you'll discover illah by going back to the entry of the narrator in the books of the narrators, and you find out, oh, wait a second. He didn't report from this person, he did report from that person. Okay? So the illah, again, it comes out for any number of given ways. Disagreements between the narrators and so on. And we mentioned a lot of the examples of that. So we're not going to go too much deep into this because in the second or third class we talked a lot about illah. So we're not going to go too deep into it. So the next one here he says is al-hadith al-muttarib. Muttarib. The next hadith is, or the next illah is ittirab. Muttarib. Like this. What does this mean? Confused. Hadith that's confused is when a person reports this hadith and the two narrators, it's a confusing hadith because the two narrations are equally as strong, but they're also completely opposite to each other. In this particular case, if the scholars of hadith can't figure out what's going on with this narration and figure out which one is more authentic, they'll say, this hadith is muttarib, this hadith is confused. Why is that? There's no way that they're both authentic, but we can't figure out which one is authentic. So that way, they will just say that both of them are not going to be accepted. It's a confusing situation. Okay? However, you can investigate further and further and further and find one that is stronger, because there's never two completely 100% hadiths, authentic hadiths that contradict each other 100%. There's no way. Prophet ﷺ is not saying one thing and then saying another thing the next day, obviously. So there is, one of them is definitely true, but we just have to do a lot of work to find out which one is true. Does that make sense? One example of this is if there's two narrations that are very, very strong, the scholars of hadith, they try to combine between the two of them. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ said, for example, in the hadith which is reported by al-Bukhari, La adwa, there's no such thing as contagion, wala tiyara, and there's no bad omens, wala hama, there are no evil owls that give you a bad omen, wala safar, and the month of Safar is not ominous. وَفِرَّ مِنَ الْمَجْذُومِ كَمَا تَفِرُّ مِنَ الْأَسَدِ, and run away from the person that has leprosy as you would run away from the person as you would run away from a lion. This hadith seemingly conflicts with the beginning of it, conflicts with the ending of it. The Prophet said there's no such thing as contagion, meaning nobody is contagious. It's all by the will of Allah Azza wa Jal. And at the end he says, but run away from those that have leprosy. So the scholars of hadith, they said, no, this actually doesn't contradict. Because although we're saying that contagion is in the hands of Allah Azza wa Jal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made contagion appear, people that are contagious. If you're around people that are contagious, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it as a part of the physical reality that we live in today, that you're going to get sick. Are you 100% going to get sick? No. But there's a good chance that you are, because that's the natural, just like for example, the fire. If you jump into a fire, you're going to get burned? Yeah, probably. But Ibrahim alayhi salam went into a fire. Was he burned? No. So that means that the fire, does it have independent ability to burn people? No. The burning, the quality of burning is something that Allah puts into fire, and He can choose to remove it from a fire if He wills. Okay? Contagion, getting sick when you're next to somebody that has leprosy, is a thing that an effect that Allah creates in leprosy, but Allah can decide to not create that effect for a given person. If there's a leprosy outbreak, or there's like a plague in certain areas, does everybody automatically die? No. Some people will die, and some people will live. This is a proof that nothing is contagious in and of itself that can act outside of the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's an example. So another way to look at it is that we look at the dates of when the Prophet ﷺ said them. There could be two hadiths that are completely opposite, but one of them was said first and another one was said later. For example, the Prophet ﷺ told people, if you cook something on a fire, you have to make wudu if you eat it. Okay? This is an authentic hadith. If you cook using a fire and then you eat that food, you have to make wudu. This was in the early days of Islam. And then this was abrogated, this ruling. The Prophet ﷺ removed this, Allah Azza wa Jalla removed this ruling and revealed to Muhammad ﷺ to tell the people that taraku al-wudu ila masathu an-nar, that the last thing the Prophet ﷺ told people, you don't have to make wudu anymore if you eat something that's been cooked on a fire. Okay? Then if we don't know which one is first and which one is last, there's a lot of different ways to figure out which one is more stronger, and that goes back to usul al-fiqh. It goes back to the science of fiqh. It's not a study of hadith at this point. But when we're trying to figure out the narrators, yes, that's the hadith part, but the actual wording of the hadith and trying to sort out which wording of the hadith is more authentic, that's the scholar of the fiqh. That's the job of the scholar of fiqh. Sometimes there is ittirab, there is a confusion in the chain of narration where a person reports it in one way and then he forgets his own chain of narration and reports it in another way. And we mentioned an example of this of the hadith of if you have the cup and you go to drink at the adhan time. This hadith is weak. It's reported by Hammad ibn Salama. Hammad ibn Salama reports it in 6 different ways. One time it stops at Urwa ibn Zubayr, who's a tabi'i. One time it stops at Abu Hurairah, who's a sahabi. One time it stops at another sahabi. One time it stops at the Prophet ﷺ. One time it goes through this generation and that one and this one. The scholars of hadith unanimously rejected it. They said Hammad was confused. Ittirab. He was muttarib. He was confused. He reported this in a bunch of different ways. None of them are authentic, and he reported the wording of the hadith wrong as well. And so this hadith is not accepted. But there's another example. There's another example which is interesting because it goes back to what we mentioned before. There's a hadith of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ where there was a woman from Banu Makhzum, from the tribe of Makhzum, who stole during the time of the Messenger ﷺ. This hadith was reported from Az-Zuhri, from Urwa, from Aisha radiallahu anha, from the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Okay? So the makhraj is one. The makhraj is the same makhraj. There's no 2 Sahaba reporting it. It's just one person reporting it. Okay? We have Zuhri from Urwa from Aisha. This is the makhraj. Okay? Then the madar of this is Az-Zuhri. From Az-Zuhri reports it a number of scholars of hadith. But one of them, his name is Ma'mar ibn Rashid. Ma'mar, he reported it in a different way. So this one here is reported that a woman stole during the time of the Messenger ﷺ. The way that Ma'mar reported it is that كانت تستعير المتاع وتجحده, which means she used to borrow things and then claim she didn't borrow it. That's a big problem here. Why is this a problem? Because these 2 rulings, stole and borrowing stuff and then not returning it, are very, very different in Islam. This does not require cutting of the hand. If you borrow somebody and then you don't give it back, you don't get your hand cut. If you stole, what is stealing in Islam? It's defined as al-ikhraju min hirz, that you go into somebody's house and you take it out of their closet, out of their possession, out of their chest, out of some locked place. So borrowing is somebody gives it to you and you don't return it. For this, there's a different ruling altogether. It's different from stealing. It's reported that this woman, the Makhzumi woman, her hand was cut off. Prophet would not cut off her hand for taking, borrowing something and not giving it back. That's not the definition of stealing. Okay? And it has to be more than rubu' dinar. It has to be more than a quarter of a dinar, which is a gold coin. So it has to be worth a decent amount of money. You don't cut hands over a bottle of water. So in this particular case, this chain of narration is actually authentic if you just look at it from far away. Ma'mar ibn Rashid is one of the biggest scholars of hadith. Thiqa. Zuhri is Zuhri. Urwa is the nephew of Aisha. Aisha from the Prophet ﷺ. This looks like a chain of narration that's authentic. Okay? But there's actually ittirab here. There's actually confusion. Ma'mar confused the wording of the hadith. So this hadith is what we said? Shadh. Goes against what the other thiqat, the other more strong narrators reported. You see? So this is an example of, he mentions this under ittirab, but this is really an example of a shadh as well. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Al-Mudraj. Al-Mudraj, from the word idraj, which means that it's just an addition. What happens is, a narrator narrates a hadith, and then he says his own comment afterwards. And then the narrator after him, or 2 later, he confuses the hadith of the Messenger ﷺ with the comment that the person made. And this happened in the hadith, for example. Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, كان يخلو بغار حراء, about the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, that the Messenger ﷺ used to go to the cave of Hira, فيتحنث فيه, and he would do tahannuth. What is tahannuth? Az-Zuhri adds a word in there. He says, وهو التعبد, means to worship. So that وَهُوَ التَّعَبُّد, it means to worship. Some scholars of hadith, they mistakenly attribute that to Aisha. That's not her speech. She didn't say that. She said يَتَحَنَّث. Az-Zuhri explained what she said by saying it means to worship. You see? So this is called mudraj. This word, if I say, Aisha said the Prophet ﷺ used to do tahannuth, and she said that it means ta'abbud. Is that a weak narration? Yes. It's not a weak interpretation of the word. The word is, that's the correct definition of the word. But I've attributed it to Aisha and she never said that. You see? Sometimes, sometimes they put the idraj in the form of, it's an explanation of something that occurred in the hadith, and sometimes they'll add something to advise people. For example, there's a hadith of Abu Hurairah. He said, "Asbighul wudu." Make wudu with plenty amount of water. وَيْلٌ لِلْأَعْقَابِ مِنَ النَّارِ. Woe to the heels from the fire. Meaning, if you don't wash your heels correctly, you can go to the hellfire because you're not making salah, because you don't have wudu. Some scholars of hadith, they considered the first part, they made a mistake. They thought the first part is part of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So they report it, they say, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said, make wudu with a plenty amount of water because woe to the heels from the fire. That, in that form, is a weak hadith. The authentic hadith, the authentic way to say it is, Abu Hurairah said, make wudu with a plenty amount of water, and then say, and he reported in this context that the Messenger ﷺ said, woe to the heels from the fire. So this is called idraj. And sometimes the idraj comes at the end of the hadith as well. It comes at the end of the hadith as well. For example, so how do we figure this out? You look at all of the hadith forms, and you see, for example, that al-Bukhari reports it, saying, I heard Abu Hurairah say, وَكَانَ يَمُرُّ بِنَا وَالنَّاسُ يَتَوَضَّؤُونَ. He passed by us while people were making wudu, and he said, make wudu plentifully, people. So now we have a story that goes with it that shows us that this word is actually not from the Prophet ﷺ. It's Abu Hurairah. He was just giving advice to people. But some of the narrators that are less strong, they didn't separate between the two, and they considered the first one a part of the hadith of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. Sometimes this happens in the chain of narration. For example, he hears a hadith from a number of scholars, and they report this hadith with different chains of narration, but he reports them in the same way. Okay? He doesn't report them in, like, for example, it'll be like this person reports it 1, 2, 3. He reports it X, Y, and Z, different chain of narration, but he makes them all into one, and he reports the hadith as one. This is idraj in the isnad. And another one is that he has two different hadiths, two separate hadiths, and he reports both of them with a single chain of narration. So he has two different hadiths. One of them could be weak, one of them could be authentic. He reports it only with the authentic one, and then he combines them both the hadiths together and says, Prophet ﷺ said this, and he said this. But people don't know that he actually has two ways that he acquired these two sentences from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so that's al-mudraj. Al-mudabbaj. Whenever a person reports from somebody that is his equal in age, then it's called al-mudabbaj. For example, Aisha reports from Abu Hurairah, and Abu Hurairah reports from Aisha. They're both Sahaba. Okay? It's called al-mudabbaj. What do we benefit from this? We benefit from this that we can verify the authenticity of narrations. Basically, that's all we get from it. When we see that a person reports from their own peer, we know that there's no mistake in the chain of narration because they're on the same age, they're from the same generation. He says, al-muttafiq wal-muftariq. Al-muttafiq, we're going through these quickly. You can review the notes, inshallah ta'ala. This isn't a type of hadith. This is basically when the names are the same and the person belonging to the name is different. Okay? For example, how many Amrs are there in the world? Millions, probably. So when you say, I heard from Amr, it's called muttafiq. Because all of the people that you heard from called Amr, they all have the same name. And al-muftariq is also is when they have different names. Okay? Sometimes people, in the books of hadith, they share the same name, and their father's name is the same, and their grandfather's name is the same, and their kunya is the same. Like they'll be called Abu Muhammad Yusuf ibn Abdullah ibn Khalid, and there'll be 3 narrators like that. Okay, in the books of hadith. We have also, for example, Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad. There's 6 famous people called Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad. One of them is Al-Khalil ibn Ahmed al-Farahidi, the famous grammarian. So we have to separate between these people. And scholars of hadith have written books on these topics to make sure that we don't mistake narrators of people that have the same exact names. He says, مؤتلف متفق الخط فقط. Okay, مؤتلف المختلف. Al-mu'talif is when the word is written the same, because remember, back in those days, they didn't have dots. What is this? This could be Bashar. This could be Yasar. This could be Nashaz. This could be a number of different things. So in the old books of hadith, it's written like this. If you have, for example, a famous narrator, his name is Muhammad ibn Bashar. Okay, Muhammad ibn Bashar. If you are a novice, you could say this in 100 different ways. But you know that Muhammad ibn Bashar, this is a person, he's a very famous narrator of hadith, his name is Ghundur. This is his nickname. So sometimes they'll say, Hadathana Muhammad ibn Bashar, and they'll put here like this, Ghundur. So that you know that this is not Nassar, not Nashaz, not Bashar, it's not, just so that you can understand who they're speaking about. So this is called al-mu'talif. This is when the name, because of the no dots in the old books, the name looks exactly the same, but it's pronounced in a different way. Another good example is like this. This could be Bashir. This could be Nusayr. This could be a bunch of different things. How do you read that? You have to know hadith to be able to read that. So the scholars wrote books on this topic to separate between them. For example, Ibn Makula, he wrote a book called Al-Ikmal on this topic. Okay? And the reason why we care about this is because this could be potentially a big deal. If somebody, his name is Muhammad ibn Nashaz, okay, and he's a weak narrator, we just weakened the hadith, but he's actually, we read it wrong. He should be Muhammad ibn Bashar, who's actually a very strong narrator. So it's very important to know this as well. Now, in this, there's actually, this happens in the chain of narration with names, and it also happens in hadiths as well. So there's a hadith that says that the Prophet ﷺ, look at that. This hadith is reported in two different ways. One of them is weak and one of them is authentic. The first way, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam ihtajara. The other way is ihtajama, like this. What is the difference between these two things? Ihtajara means he took a hujra, he put like a tent in the masjid. One of them means he did cupping in the masjid. The one that's about cupping is the weak hadith. But some scholars of hadith, some scholars of fiqh, they took the position that it's permissible to do cupping in the masjid from a hadith which was written in looks like this. It can have both. Some of them, they write in very bad handwriting. This can be ihtajama or ihtajara, right? And so because they confuse the two, some scholars of fiqh said that it's permissible for a person to do hijama in the masjid. However, this hadith has nothing to do with it. Okay, the next one he says al-munkar. Al-munkar, from the word, al-munkar means it's rejectable, rejected. Okay? Munkar, like this. Munkar is a big deal in hadith sciences. And so we might, inshallah ta'ala, have to do this next week, bi'idhnillah, is the last class. And because we don't have a lot left to do from the theory side, I'm going to bring a number of hadiths with me that we're going to do practical application of science of hadith. So we're going to go through weak hadiths, authentic hadiths, find ilal in certain hadiths. I have like 10 or 15 hadiths that we'll go through, inshallah ta'ala, that are interesting. So we'll discuss al-munkar if we have time before the adhan. How much time is to the adhan? He's going to call adhan now. Okay, so we'll stop here because al-munkar needs a little bit more discussion than normal. And then he goes on to talk about al-matruk, the one that is abandoned, and then al-mawdu', the fabricated, and that's the end of the book. So we'll discuss that bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala next week. And subhanakallahumma wa hamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know, inshallah, now.